Guys, so I got something quite a bit different for you guys here. Um, so as same as before, this is gonna be hybrid, me reading off of a script, but also trying not to read off of it directly as much as possible. So anyway, um, so I finished Metroid Prime 4 a couple of weeks ago, and I had been wanting really badly to talk about it. Not just Metroid Prime 4, but also a concept that I think is important to the Metroidvania genre that doesn't seem to get much floor time, despite it being, in my opinion, as important as combat, let's say. Though a pretty substantial majority of the post-mortem discussion around Prime 4's shortfall centered around things like the chatty NPCs or the tacked-on open world, some people at least have pointed out just how linear the game felt. Better yet, some went even deeper and noted a lack of interconnectivity, as they called it, and that is exactly what I want to talk about: interconnectivity. So, the intuition on this observation that interconnectivity has something to do with the kind of middling experience of Prime 4 is, in my opinion, completely correct. But since I'm in the process of developing my own Metroidvania, this is something that's really important to me and something that I really care about because I feel like a large portion of the quality of my game is going to depend on it. Map design, in my experience, overwhelmingly often plays second fiddle to what many consider, and not entirely mistakenly, the bona fides of Metroidvanias: the combat, the movement, and all the other stuff. That doesn't mean people don't appreciate the map as an institution of the genre and that the fact that some maps can be better or worse than others. It's more that I don't think it's really well appreciated just how deeply embedded and manifold the tendrils of map design are in the experience of a game. At worst, I think maps are just seen as canvases that exist only to house and serve other more important things like enemies or combat or whatever. But so that I can be really precise about what I mean, I'm going to make up a term here. Instead of saying map design, I'm going to say map topology, because I think the term map design is so tortured at this point for having been used to describe just about anything that it's lost all usefulness and meaning in technical discussion. So, a working definition for my purposes of topology, specifically map topology, is basically the configuration of many different parts and the abstract qualities that we get as a result of a given configuration. In other words, how putting things together in certain proportions can give us wildly different results. Whether you realize it or not, every Metroidvania you've ever played has a very unique configuration of rooms, spaces, areas, and connections, and that unique configuration dramatically alters your gameplay experience from one game to another. And that's not just because you get a different spatial impression of the world, though that is a small part of it. It's because map topology mediates some of the most important gameplay mechanisms of the genre. It mediates pacing, and by extension, backtracking. It mediates how memorable the world is by virtue of how easy a route or a path is to derive from memory, how intuitive it is to navigate, and how new areas excite your imagination. For example, you could take every room in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, keep everything the exact same, and just randomly rearrange everything, and the game quality would dramatically fluctuate with each given permutation of rooms. These things so often go unnoticed because the effects of these things are cumulative. Unlike combat, whose totality you experience largely all at once, map topology is something you experience over time. It's not something you can point to per se. If Metroidvanias were books, the combat would be punchy word choices, quotes, phrases, rhetorical devices, and map topology would be the syntax, mood, and style. If you go through a book, and you wanted to make an example of the author's wordy word choice, you would compile a list of individual words. And you could say, hey, look, I can point to these. You could show someone. But if you wanted to indicate or make an example of the style, you couldn't really do that. The person that you're trying to make an example to would have to read the book themselves because it's this complex interplay of many different parts. So I'm going to show you guys the three things I got on screen here. Each one is a representation of different maps from three different Metroid games modeled with the tools of a field of math called graph theory. Don't worry, it's not going to be showing any numbers or anything, just visual tools. But these maps, one of which is from Metroid Prime 1, one from Metroid Prime 4, and the last from Metroid Dread. And I want you guys to think about which graph you think belongs to which game, and maybe think for a second about why you think that, so that we can maybe compare notes a little bit. So the first one here, just like, you don't have to like really know anything or be able to extract any real significant technical details from this. You can just eyeball it and see each of these. You can eyeball them and just notice certain things about them. This one is, it's got a lot of, it's very interconnected. On the topic of interconnectivity, this one's very interconnected. If there were a country called Interconnectivity, this would be the fucking national flag. All right, so it's very interconnected, very deeply interconnected, and as it kind of like the going thesis is that interconnectivity just is categorically good. Lacking that explains to explain a to identify a lacking interconnectivity is to explain what Metroid Prime 4 lacked. So just keep that in mind. Hopefully that made sense. So just very, a lot of loops, a lot of interconnections, a lot of circuits. Just there's a ton of choice. Each, and maybe I should explain. I kind of assumed it was intuitive, but I don't want to assume too much. Each of these dots represents a room, and the edge or the line between each dot is the connection between each room. So you can see, if you're going through this, you come to this little red dot here. It's like, well, damn, dude, that's like 6 different choices of where I could go in this room. That's a lot. And then you go down this path, and it gets very, you can tell that it's just, there's a lot there. With this one's quite a bit more subdued, quite a bit more muted as far as interconnectivity goes. But the interconnectivity is not lacking. There is still a surfeit of choice here. You come to this point, you have 5 different places you could go, and there's some interconnectivity, but not nearly as much as over here on the left. And now finally on the right, we have what appears to mostly just be like a straight line. There's some junctures where you can go off the beat, off the main path, but for the most part it's a straight line. So pause for a second if you have to. Think about why you think, guess which one, make your best educated guess about which one you think is which. But I'm going to tell you now. This one on the left is Metroid Dread. This is a map of Cataris. The one in the middle is a map of Chozo Ruins from Prime 1. And on the far right, you have the Ice Belt from Metroid Prime 4. So, to me, Prime 1 just lords over Dread and Metroid Prime 4 as a Metroidvania. It's actually because of Dread's, in my opinion, kind of questionable map topology that I rank it kind of low among the Metroid games. I think it excels as a 2D side-scroller. I'd give it like a solid A or A+ on those grounds. But because it sort of begrudgingly wears the chain of Metroidvania conventions around its neck instead of just committing to the bit as a 2D side-scroller, it winds up being this weird half-breed for me. And as sort of an aside here, I think that kind of a shared trait between Dread and Prime 4, just on the topic more generally of how map topology can affect the overall experience of a game, backtracking is something that it's somewhat controversial, but to me, backtracking is, it's very often viewed as the kind of like stinky tar of the oil refinement process. That's sort of just to be shuffled off, hidden away, instead of, for what it is, a valuable raw resource that can be used. And a game can do one of 3 things when it comes to backtracking. It can ignore it, hope it goes away, which it never will, and it'll accumulate and it'll make the game worse for it. You can lean into it, recognize that it's an inescapable part of the genre, and as a matter of fact, I would argue that in Prime 1 would not be the game it is without backtracking, and I don't say that as just like incidental. I would bet that backtracking was deliberately leveraged in Prime 1 to create certain effects. So that's a topic for a different day. But it seems like Nintendo, there is some directive somewhere in Nintendo that maybe backtracking is viewed as this outdated design modality that should just be disposed of in as much as it is possible to do so. And I think that's a mistake to do so. And I see the mistake in doing that manifest in both Dread and Metroid Prime 4, just in like polar opposite ways. To me, one is very over connected. There's too much interconnectivity in Dread. There's too little in Metroid Prime 4. But anyway, all that in mind, let's revisit this idea of interconnectivity. So sometimes when you notice a desirable effect in a piece of media, something that makes you feel a certain way, you try to identify the source of that feeling, so that you can reproduce it. But it is all too easy to misidentify something that is actually just a manifestation of a deeper principle as the source of that effect itself, and in doing so, you wind up totally whiffing. There's this tweet someone made once. It was a really good tweet. It was very insightful. I can't remember exactly who made it or what they said, but I'll paraphrase. It was that a lot of video essayists and a lot of game design discourse centers around viewing game design choices, and inferring the intent of game designers through the lens of a finished product. It's like looking at a rose bush. It's very easy to, look at the rose bush and think, the rose explains the bush. The rose is the centerpiece of the bush. But no, the seed, the soil, that is what explains the rose, the rose flower. The rose flower does not explain the bush. And so the same idea kind of applies to interconnectivity in Metroidvanias, which is to say, interconnectivity isn't by itself a desirable property in the sense that it's something that I think should be explicitly aimed for, so much as it's a natural byproduct of good map topology. Metroid Prime 4 and Metroid Dread, in my opinion, are on two ends of a horseshoe that converges at its extremes. To me, Dread's mistake was being too interconnected such that backtracking was effectively removed. Prime 4 had little interconnection and had an identical issue. So the issue is neither a lack nor an abundance of interconnectivity, but a meaningful sense of choice, agency, or discovery from which a good balance of interconnectedness naturally visually manifests. And achieving those things isn't as simple as giving people a shitload of options. It's about configuring and structuring maps in strategic and specific ways to give the illusion of freedom, which is often, to me, even more desirable than true freedom, if you want to call it that. For example, Castlevania Circle of the Moon is one of my all-time favorites, but despite it having arguably more choice about where to go than in Symphony of the Night, for example, a lot of that choice, to me at least, feels fake and unsatisfying because discoverable rooms meant to supply you with new places and excuses to use your upgrades seem mostly like retrofitted afterthoughts, since they're largely just individual rooms tacked onto whatever open space was available on the map at the time. So achieving that sense of meaningful choice and agency in where you go, even if the game has an intended path, is deceptively more involved than just turning the map into some huge convoluted labyrinth or maze. So in summary, interconnectivity, I think that people are correct in identifying that has something to do with it. They're at least grazing the surface of the concept of map topology. But interconnectivity or interconnectedness itself is not a desirable quality, because as we saw with Dread, I think Dread is on the extreme example of it is so over-connected that it ends up just being, strangely enough, linear. And so that it's not that interconnectivity is something you should necessarily shoot for, but that interconnectivity is just a natural consequence of the structures and methods of building up good map topology that embodies and gives rise to these authentic senses of exploration, discovery, novelty. So anyway, so this is the first time really on this channel that I've posted anything even sort of like this. I'm trying to kind of ease into posting things other than Smash stuff. So if I do hope that you guys found this interesting, because this has really become what I care about at the moment. I really care about this stuff, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about it. So hopefully you guys find it interesting. But yeah, I'll certainly be posting about this more often in the coming weeks and months. So anyway, if you guys made it this far, I appreciate you guys listening. And again, hope you guys found it interesting. And I'll see you guys later.